Hello everyone, welcome to a new project that we have with the Foxhall Foundation. Foxhall Foundation, as many of you know, is a foundation that Dr. Yamamoto and I started a couple of years ago. It is providing this avenue for you to experience wellness through the age spectrum. So as promised by Dr. Yamamoto, this is your 10 minutes with Dr. Thomas with our update for the week. As Dr. Yamamoto says, good health doesn't just happen. You have to build it as you age, and that is part of the foundation principle. Soon we will be publishing a book based on the pyramid of prevention. This is just a quick slide that gives you a display of what we think is the way towards health, aging, wellness. Today's talk is This Week in Medicine. We will start this and hopefully we can update it every week. The purpose of This Week in Medicine is for me to help you curate the internet, the press, the media, scientific literature, and give you some feedback to keep you up to date. A lot of this, I will say, is probably curated through your help. It is frequent that a patient or a friend will send me a literature reference, a citation, and I'm happy to read them and review them. It's part of keeping up to date. It's part of continuing medical education. So I'm happy to do some of that with you and present it in this format. We'll have a section on quick action tips from Tony. Tony has something magical that he does every week. It depends on the patient. It depends on the situation, but we all know Tony can pull miracles out of a hat. And so we'll have a quick action tip from Tony, hopefully on a regular basis, that will help you. And then we'll have a section called Rapid Reminders or the Fast Pitch. The Fast Pitch are just quick bullet information items that I'm going to give you to help. They may or may not apply to you, but I think in general they'll help everybody. So to start with, for This Week in Medicine, back in 1994 when Dr. Yamamoto and I were training in medicine, we had a patient at our training institution who used language to the effect of, "These doctors are terrible," but it was probably much more colorful than that. And we hear this a lot. I think that there's a lot of frustration with the messages that people are getting, and in particular with this pandemic, there's frustration with the messages from medical science, from your own personal doctor, from politicians, of course, from the FDA, CDC, and I think some of this frustration with messaging comes from understanding how medical science works. So we would all like to think that everything can be tested in the randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial, which means that you randomize your patients, you give them an intervention or not, and then you see what the outcome is. So that's the ideal in medicine, but rarely can that happen because it's a very complicated system. Patients and populations and disease are too complicated to make this always the gold standard. Does Dr. Google allow you to understand medicine if you're not a doctor? Well, it's helpful, but don't substitute it for a relationship with a physician. It is hard to get a relationship with a physician these days. There are a lot of access issues, rural access, access because of insurance. So don't ask Dr. Google, but if you do, at least talk to your physician about what you found on your Google search, because Google does not replace the medical training of a physician. So another problem that I see quite frequently is patients coming from their background and their education and their training, trying to understand how medicine works in the context of their scientific experience. I have a big family full of engineers, so the engineers have a different perspective on how science is employed and used, maybe more precision. So they're trying to understand medicine from their scientific background, and medical theory and medical testing doesn't necessarily make sense for them in their context. The same thing with commercial real estate. I think we know there might be some commercial real estate people out there who are trying to understand medicine and maybe even in important leadership positions, and they have a hard time understanding medicine. So there is a lot of frustration, and I think it's hard to trust medical science in these times, but you have to be careful with the bad medical science. And it's pretty easy to see that from the past couple of years. Plaquenil and how that was rolled out, that's not usually how we do quote unquote medical science. Medical science is peer reviewed. It's hard to keep it pure and in its best essence in a pandemic and medical urgency. But the way that Plaquenil was studied and rolled out would not be what we would consider good medical science. We have other examples like universal oral estrogen therapy for women. We gave everyone that data in the 1970s and 80s, and then women were upset, as were doctors, that we found other data later that said, maybe we shouldn't be giving women universally estrogen replacement therapy orally. So patients would get frustrated with that as well. Why did medicine work that way? You sent us one message and then you replaced it with another. Part of that is because medical science evolves and medical science changes. And right now it's doing that very quickly. So what stressed you out this week? I got a lot of emails from patients. I get a lot of emails every week. I love your emails. I love to read your emails. So here is a little perspective on what we saw this week in the inbox in Dr. Thomas's office. So we saw that there were questions about ivermectin. No, ivermectin is not a treatment for COVID. It's an antiparasitic medication, so we shouldn't be taking it. And it's not supposed to be prescribed by physicians for COVID. There's no science behind that. Booster shots, we'll get to that in a minute. Hurricane Ida certainly upset a lot of us this week. There are long waits in our local emergency rooms. In the hospitals in my area, I check pretty much every day for the census to see how many patients are there, how many patients might have COVID. The emergency rooms are full at many of our local hospitals, more so than probably in the past 18 months of this pandemic. The J&J shot for a second shot is also being discussed quite a bit. I'm hoping every day that we'll get an answer on the second shot for J&J vaccine. One of the creators of the vaccine, Dr. Baruch, has told us, keep waiting. The data is there for a second J&J shot, so hopefully we will hear soon. The data is there. Masking again? Well, yes, a lot of people have asked, should we be masking again? I think we should be masking again. The Delta virus is extremely contagious, and it looks like for people who are not vaccinated, it's a more serious illness than the original Alpha variant of COVID. Vaccine for kids, because kids went back to school this week, so that was very frustrating, especially kids under 12 who were not eligible for a vaccine. That was very frustrating for parents and patients' grandparents as well. There is an element right now of doctor-nurse burnout. It was mentioned yesterday to me from a Hopkins colleague. She quoted a 40% burnout rate. I didn't ask her what study she obtained this from, but I believe her. I believe there's a 40% burnout rate. So be careful accessing the medical system right now because the burnout rate is high, and that means we have fewer nurses, probably leads into the long wait in the emergency room, and the doctors are also trying to recoup their energy and keep going. Back to school masking was also discussed this week. It's been mandatory in a lot of our local jurisdictions and probably should be in every jurisdiction. So those are the big ones, but the one I will start with today is boosters. So we will start talking about booster shots because that has been the predominant email I've received this week. To boost or not to boost? That is the question. So a lot of patients are asking me, rightly so, should I boost? And we kind of have to go back to how do the shots work? So how are these shots working? How does a flu shot work? How does your hepatitis B vaccine work? How do travel vaccines work? You probably know some of these vaccines you need to repeat. If you get a typhoid booster for travel, it depends on whether it's oral or injectable, the frequency that you have to redo that shot. Not all shots need to be redone. Hepatitis B vaccination tends to be good for life. So the shots work by initially creating a boost of immunity that some of us felt with our COVID vaccines. But that's just B-cell immunity that we can measure and we feel. There are longer-term types of immunity like the T-cell system and further on in the immune system process that still protect us. And the question comes, if I didn't have antibodies, does that mean I'm still immune? Yes, you really could still be immune. There's a very good article by Catherine Wu in The Atlantic this week that discusses immunity and how shots work. It's very complicated. Her article in particular is heavy with science, but it's very good. Shots are complicated. The usual effectiveness even of the flu shot, remember, is only about 40 to 60% per flu season. And it's effective at 40 to 60%. So we don't have to have a 96% effective flu shot to actually help control epidemic flu. And remember, flu kills. Flu kills every year. This past year it did not. Is that because we were all masked? Could have been. Is it because so many people did the flu shot this year because they were worried about the combination of flu and COVID illness at the same time? Potentially. So one more pitch on the flu shot. Do your flu shot, not now. Do your flu shot perhaps October through December, because flu season in our area is February through April. And I get this question a lot. Should I be doing my flu shot now? I would prefer that you didn't, because there's some very good research from multiple studies that show that the peak efficacy of the flu shot is about 100 days. So if we get our first cases of seasonal influenza in January, February, March, then if you count back 100 days, probably getting your flu shot now in August and September is not going to be helpful at that time. You want peak efficacy, and that lasts about 100 days after the flu shot. Now, the question on the booster, to get a booster shot or not, I thought of it in a different way. Would you get a booster shot of last year's flu shot, last year's flu vaccine? Is this coronavirus mutating enough that the shot that was developed originally by Pfizer and Moderna and J&J, is that shot still effective against the Delta variant? Is it still effective against any of the other variants? It might not be. It might be. They're studying that right now. So since there are trials ongoing and Pfizer enrolled people in a clinical trial of a Delta-specific vaccine last month in August, we could wait for that data on that vaccine. It will be a new vaccine, different than the ones that we were getting from Pfizer and Moderna. So if you want to wait for the results of that trial from last month in August that enrolled patients who got a Delta-specific booster, I would expect that those results will be out this year. A very good quote from one of the papers I read this week came from Dr. Gandhi, who's a professor at UCSF, who's the co-director of the Infectious Disease Clinic. You can read it on our slide. The promise of all vaccines is against severe disease, hospitalization, and death. And I think you can see that in many of the slides, and I'll show them to you, and graphs that demonstrate protection against severe disease and hospitalization. And we know that because we hear about the rates of people in ICUs who are unvaccinated. It's almost entirely the unvaccinated. There was never a promise for sterilizing immunity, just like we don't sterilize immunity against influenza because the virus mutates regularly. We're probably not going to sterilize with any of our vaccines. So the disappointment in the public is that there's a perception that these vaccines didn't work. They did, but it depends on how you define work. This is a slide showing the article by Catherine Wu if you want to dig deep into the science of immunity. And her byline, reports of vaccines decline have been overstated. I would say that's true because you have to look deeper at the data coming from Israel. There's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot to understand about the data from Israel. So to say that these vaccines have somehow stopped working is likely incorrect. This is a very good article. I do recommend it if you want more information. This was a slide that was amped up a bit. It came from an original CDC report. The CDC report didn't have the highlights in red. The article that took these slides out of the CDC report added them, and I think it was nice emphasis because you can see the flat line, the flat green line are vaccinated patients from January 2021 to present. So the past 9 months, you can see that their rate of hospitalization is flat. You see the rate of hospitalization of the not vaccinated peaked when we all say that we had the peak, the COVID peak in April and May, and maybe starting to go up again in the unvaccinated. So this is a great slide. It just points out exactly what we know, flat line for vaccinated patients for hospitalization. This slide, similar from the CDC data, vaccine effectiveness in the pre-Delta and Delta periods. 2 columns. You have the column for infection or symptomatic disease. You can see that infection, yeah, clearly it's still happening. Delta virus is definitely, if you have vaccine effectiveness on this side, we're getting some waning vaccine effectiveness on infection or symptomatic disease. But look at the numbers for hospitalization or severe disease. Vaccine effectiveness is still pretty good. So that's what we were hoping for our vaccines. And Delta virus, well, like I said, we're working on it. The companies are working on it. Recently this week was the Bangladesh mask study. This was carried out by people from Yale, Stanford, and I believe UC Berkeley. They gave masks to people randomized in 600 villages, 350,000 individuals, two groups, mask and no mask. And the masks they were wearing were cloth masks or surgical masks. So this was not with fancy KN95 masks or N95 masks. These were either basic surgical mask, or cloth mask. So they were not able to get 100% enrollment. They used financial incentives. They used imams in the mosques. They used encouragement. They had a lot of behavioral techniques that were employed through this study to try and encourage local people to wear these masks. So they were able to increase mask wearing from 14 to 43%. And even in just that small of a percentage of increase, there was a significant decline in COVID in seniors in the communities that wore the masks. So this was felt to be a very good study that documented what many of us already know, that masks work. Even my own anecdotal experience, when full PPE or personal protective equipment was employed in our local hospital, there were no infections from COVID from the period of perhaps April last year to the end of the year, because everyone was wearing their personal protective equipment in the hospital with infected COVID patients and not getting COVID. So masks do work. The surgical mask in this study did outperform the cloth mask. I personally don't like these cloth masks. If you're going to wear a cloth mask right now, I'd recommend getting a filter put in it. We modified our cloth masks at home, put rubber bands on the other side, or elastics actually we sewed on the other side of these masks, and then fit in a filter. This is not the way to wear your surgical mask. I see probably 25 to 50 people every day wearing their surgical mask with the mask under their nose. There's a very good research trial from Johns Hopkins that Andy Lane was the lead author on, where they tested the nasal tissue, I believe it was post-surgical specimens done for other reasons, to look for the ACE receptor, which is involved in attachment and entrance to the cell of the coronavirus. The nose is heavily populated with ACE receptors. So clearly, if you're wearing your mask under your nose, it might be essentially like not wearing a mask. So please, everyone, if you're going to wear a surgical mask, at least get it up over your nose with the metal band up on this side, not under your chin, but up over your nose and pinched around the nose. That is what you want to protect. Here's the N95 mask. Here's the KN95 mask. COVID antibody testing. I had a lot of questions this week about COVID antibody testing. Ask me, and you did. So I'm happy to answer those questions as well. It's very much for specific populations. If we have a patient who has chronic lymphoma, chronic cancer, on chemotherapy, if they have a positive COVID antibody test after being vaccinated twice, that is great news. If it's negative, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have immunity, but it's highly suggestive they don't because they're immunocompromised. If you're not immunocompromised and you're otherwise healthy, it may not mean the same thing to have a negative antibody test. Yes, positive antibody tests are encouraging, but they have not been scientifically validated to ensure that you are immune or even not immune. So at this point, these are considered experimental use, and they haven't even been EUA'd, so there's not any experimental use authorization for doing COVID antibody testing. It's being done really mostly for people who are immunocompromised. And certainly we can consider some people over 65 immunocompromised, but for the purposes of antibody testing for boosters or testing immunity, when we say immunocompromised, we generally mean transplant patients, people with chronic cancer, people who have immune system defects, people on chemotherapy. There is some hope. There will be a randomized trial likely starting in November of two of the antibody therapies, Regeneron and the one from GlaxoSmithKline, to take patients who have had probably 3 of the mRNA vaccines, but still don't have measurable antibodies, and we're concerned that they have no immunity from their immunizations, you could enroll in a trial that would give you prophylactic antibody therapy to see if that would help decrease your risk of getting COVID, because you can't mount a response to a vaccine. So that may be coming in a couple months. Tony's tip of the week: write down this phone number if you have a Philips sleep apnea machine that you need to return because they were recalled because of problems inhaling particulate matter from the mask. So for many weeks, we did not know how to help patients get these masks returned, but Tony was able to find out this is the phone number for patients to call to get your mask replaced. Thanks, Tony. Fast pitch real quick. Our fast pitch messages for the week. Remember, the new age for colon cancer screening is 45. You can do Cologuard if you have no family history. And for the Cologuard purposes, that's 2 people younger than 60 years old who have colon cancer, who are first-degree relatives, or people with Lynch syndrome, which is non-hereditary polyposis colon cancer. So if you don't have that in your family, talk to your doctor about Cologuard, and it's now covered by Medicaid. So this is a very, very good test. High ratings, very helpful. Get your flu shot now is kind of silly. We don't want people to get their flu shots right now. Again, flu season really starts in January, February of next year. The peak efficacy for the flu shot is 100 days. So getting it now in August and September doesn't really help protect you in January, February, and March of next year. Don't do your mammogram after COVID vaccine. Most people understand that it causes local lymph node swelling and inflammation. So getting a mammogram after your COVID vaccine could make your mammogram positive. So just remember, try not to schedule your mammogram, especially if you get a COVID booster. Foxhall Wellness and Kensington are having a grand opening celebration. Yes, we are having it anyway, regardless of the Delta wave of infection. But it is a mask-only event, and we would encourage you to come only if you will wear a mask. And of course, we would love it if everybody who came was vaccinated, but this is also open to children under the age of 12 who are not vaccinated. Just wear your mask. It's this Saturday coming up, and we do realize this is September 11th, but in our feeling at the foundation, it's an honor and a tribute to those who lost their lives on 9/11, and it's the spirit of perseverance and generosity that we extend at our wellness center that we feel is in the spirit of people who lived their lives and died on 9/11. The event is from 10 to 2. We'll have demonstrations from our yoga instructor, our karate instructor. The doctors will talk, even though we probably talked too much already. We have bagels and snacks. Again, mask-only event. And there's parking in the basement level, and we'll validate your parking. Again, one more pitch for the pyramid of prevention. We'll explain this more in future talks. Remember our book, You Can Prevent a Stroke, available on Amazon, which does discuss vascular health and prevention. That's it for this week.